October 16th, 1888. A man named George Lusk received a package in the mail. Inside the package was half of a human kidney. The letter that came with it claimed the other half had been fried and eaten. When doctors examined the kidney, they concluded it had been removed from a living woman. The letter was signed, "From Hell." The man who sent it was never identified, never found, never brought to justice. This is the story of Jack the Ripper. Not the legend, but the truth of what happened in those streets. And why, after 130 years, we still don't have an answer. It is the autumn of 1888. The city of London breathes in the dark. In the East End, a labyrinth of alleyways, crowded lodging houses, and gas lamps that barely cut through the fog. Somewhere between midnight and the first gray light of morning, a woman is walking alone. She doesn't know she's being followed. Nobody ever does. Between August and November of 1888, at least 5 women were murdered in the Whitechapel district of London. Their killer was never caught, never identified, never brought to justice. He sent taunting letters to the press and the police. He carved his victims with what medical examiners would call surgical precision. He vanished into the fog, as completely as a ghost. And over 130 years later, we still don't know who he was. Tonight we go to Whitechapel. To understand what happened in Whitechapel in 1888, you first have to understand what Whitechapel was. London in the late Victorian era was a city of extraordinary contrasts. In the West, gas-lit drawing rooms, top hats, and the trappings of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. But in the East End, something entirely different was happening. Whitechapel was a place where poverty had compounded for generations. It was home to roughly 80,000 people, crammed into a square mile of courts, rookeries, and tenement slums. The streets smelled of coal smoke, animal waste, and the acrid bite of the tanneries and slaughterhouses that dotted the district. In the lodging houses, or doss houses, as they were known, a bed for the night cost 4 pennies. If you didn't have 4 pennies, you slept in the street. The women who would become the Ripper's victims lived in this world. They worked as flower sellers, market traders, seamstresses. And when those options failed, as they often did, they turned to prostitution, not as a lifestyle, but as a last resort. Enough money for a bed, enough to survive one more night. It's important to say that out loud and sit with it for a moment. These were not nameless figures in a historical crime story. They were real people, mothers, daughters, sisters, ground down by a world that had left them with almost nothing. And into that world, something monstrous arrived. The police force tasked with protecting Whitechapel was the H Division of the Metropolitan Police, headquartered at Leman Street. Policing in 1888 was nothing like what we know today. No forensic science, no blood typing, no fingerprinting. That technology wouldn't be adopted by Scotland Yard for another decade. Investigators had only their eyes, their instincts, and whatever witnesses were willing to tell them. The Metropolitan Police employed just 437 officers to cover the East End, a district of nearly 1 million people. Their gas-lit beats wound through streets so narrow that 2 people could barely walk side by side. The fog that rolled in off the Thames on autumn nights was notorious, reducing visibility to just a few feet. It was, in other words, the perfect hunting ground. Ripperologists, the name given to those who have devoted themselves to studying this case, generally agree on 5 victims. They're called the Canonical Five. Each of their stories deserves to be told not as a list of names and dates, but as what they actually were. The final chapters of 5 human lives. Mary Ann Nichols, August 31st, 1888. At 3:40 in the morning, a carter named Charles Cross is walking down Bucks Row, a narrow street lined with warehouses, on his way to work. He notices what he thinks is a bundle of tarpaulin lying in a stable doorway. He walks closer. It isn't tarpaulin. Mary Ann Nichols, known to friends as Polly, was 43 years old. She had 5 children from a marriage that had long since collapsed. She had been trying to save enough money for a Doss house bed that night. When the police doctor arrives and examines her, he notes that her throat has been cut, twice, deeply, and from left to right. Her abdomen has been mutilated. He says, with the clinical composure doctors are trained to maintain, that she had not been dead for more than half an hour. Half an hour. The streets of Bucks Row were walked by a police constable every 30 minutes. The killer had come and gone between one pass and the next, as though he knew exactly how much time he had. Annie Chapman. September 8th, 1888. 8 days later. Annie Chapman was 47 years old. She had been a widow for 2 years, surviving on a small allowance from her late husband's family, an allowance that had stopped arriving. She sold flowers. She crocheted and sold those too. It was never enough. She was found in the backyard of a lodging house at 29 Hanbury Street, a cramped, dark passage between the house and a wooden fence. Her throat had been severed so completely that she was very nearly decapitated. But what disturbed the attending physician, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, more than anything else, was what had been done afterward. Her abdominal cavity had been opened. Certain organs had been removed and arranged, deliberately, methodically, around her body. Dr. Phillips would later testify that the dissection showed anatomical knowledge, not the frenzied act of someone in a rage. Something practiced, something deliberate. At the inquest, he refused to describe the full extent of the injuries in open court. He said the details were too disturbing for public record. Think about what it takes to disturb a Victorian coroner into silence. The double event, September 30th, 1888. In a single night, he struck twice. Elizabeth Stride, Long Liz as people knew her, was found just after 1 o'clock in the morning in Dutfield's yard, off Berner Street. Her throat had been cut, but unlike the previous victims, she hadn't been mutilated further. The prevailing theory among investigators was that he had been interrupted. Someone, a man driving a pony and cart into the yard, had nearly stumbled upon him in the act. He fled, and then, apparently unsatisfied, he found another. Catherine Eddowes was found less than an hour later, barely a mile away, in Mitre Square. She had been mutilated severely, her face deliberately disfigured, her left kidney and a portion of her uterus removed. A piece of her apron had been cut away and carried from the scene. That piece of apron was found later that morning, dropped in a doorway at Goulston Street. Above it, chalked on the wall, were words that would become one of the most debated inscriptions in criminal history. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren made the decision to have the message erased before it could be photographed. He feared it would incite anti-Semitic riots in a district where Jewish immigrants had already faced hostility. It was a decision that would haunt the investigation forever. A potential clue, wiped from history at dawn. Mary Jane Kelly, November 9th, 1888. The last of the canonical five. Mary Jane Kelly was 25 years old, the youngest of the victims by far. She was Irish, reportedly beautiful, and known to sing in the streets when she was in good spirits. She rented a tiny ground-floor room at 13 Miller's Court, reached by a narrow passage off Dorset Street. She was discovered at 10:45 in the morning when her landlord sent a man to collect overdue rent. The man knocked. There was no answer. He looked through a broken window pane. He immediately ran for the police. Unlike the previous murders, which had all occurred outdoors and required speed, Mary Jane Kelly's killer had been inside, alone with his victim, for what investigators estimated to be several hours. The room at Miller's Court bore the evidence of that time. The fireplace had been burning so intensely that it had melted the solder off a kettle. A pile of ash in the grate included the remains of women's clothing. What had been done to Mary Jane Kelly in that room was so extreme that the attending physician, Dr. Thomas Bond, was moved to write in his report that the injuries could only have been inflicted by a strong man. The investigating officers who entered that room never spoke about it in detail for the rest of their lives. After November 9th, 1888, the murder stopped. No arrest, no confession, no explanation, just silence. During the autumn of 1888, Scotland Yard and the Central News Agency received hundreds of letters claiming to be from the killer. Most were quickly dismissed as hoaxes, the product of a sensation-hungry public that had become morbidly fascinated with the case. The newspapers fed the frenzy, printing every detail, speculating wildly, turning a serial killer into a kind of dark folk legend in real time. But three communications stood out, and they have never been fully explained. The first arrived on September 27th, 1888, 3 days before the double event. It was addressed to the Central News Agency and written in red ink. It was mocking, jaunty, almost playful in tone. The writer called himself Jack the Ripper, the name that would define the case for over a century. He wrote that he loved his work and would continue. He joked about saving the ears of his next victim to send to the police. When Catherine Eddowes was found 3 days later with her ear nicked and a piece of her apron missing, investigators began to wonder whether the letter had been genuine. The second, a postcard, arrived 2 days after the double event. It referenced both killings using the phrase double event before that term had appeared in the press. Critics argue this means the writer had inside knowledge. Supporters of the hoax theory argue the postcard could have been sent after the event was publicly known, but before certain papers went to print. The third letter is different from the others. It arrived on October 16th, sent not to the press or the police, but to a man named George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a group of local businessmen who had organized patrols in response to the murders. It arrived in a small cardboard box. Inside the box, along with the letter, was half of a preserved human kidney. The letter, now known as the From Hell letter after its opening line, was crudely written, its spelling erratic, as though written by someone who had either little education or who was deliberately obscuring their literacy. It claimed the kidney had been fried and eaten. It claimed the other half was still in the writer's possession. A Dr. Thomas Openshaw at the London hospital examined the kidney. He concluded it belonged to a woman aged around 45 who had suffered from Bright's disease, a kidney condition that Catherine Eddowes was believed to have. The renal artery had been cut in a way consistent with how a kidney would be removed from a body. Not the kidney of a cadaver. Removed from a living person. George Lusk initially dismissed the package as a prank. A medical student with a dark sense of humor, perhaps. He was eventually persuaded to have it examined. When the results came back, he reportedly went pale. Of all the communications associated with this case, the From Hell letter is the one most widely believed by serious researchers to have been genuine. Not written by a journalist chasing a story. Not written by a thrill seeker. Written by someone who wanted you to know exactly what they were capable of. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders was, by almost any measure, a catastrophe. This isn't entirely the fault of the men tasked with solving it. They were working without tools that we take for granted. No blood analysis, no ballistics, no psychological profiling. They relied on witnesses. And witnesses in Whitechapel were, for a variety of understandable reasons, reluctant to come forward. But there were also failures of leadership. Turf wars between the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, whose jurisdiction overlapped in these streets, meant that critical information wasn't always shared. The decision to wipe the Goulston Street message before photographing it remains one of the most criticized calls in the history of British policing. The lead investigator, Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, was a respected and methodical officer. He had spent years working undercover in the East End and knew Whitechapel streets like the back of his hand. He interviewed witnesses. He built a picture, piece by piece. And in private, he never fully let the case go, even after he retired. When asked late in life whether he had an idea of who the Ripper was, he gave an answer that was more revealing than it appeared. Yes, but I cannot say. What did he know? What had he uncovered in those final years of private inquiry that he took with him to his grave in 1929? We don't know. We may never know. Scotland Yard formally closed the active investigation in 1892, though the file was never officially marked solved. The Ripper files were sealed, and then gradually released to the public over the following century. Researchers have pored over every page, and in doing so, have made a startling discovery. Some of the most critical evidence is missing. Photographs, documents, witness statements, pieces of the physical record that should exist, according to the index of the files, but which simply aren't there. Whether they were lost, deliberately destroyed, or removed, and by whom, is yet another question the case refuses to answer. In 130 years of investigation, research, and obsession, over 100 people have been seriously named as potential suspects in the Whitechapel murders. Some are fanciful, the kind of theories that make good books but dissolve under scrutiny. Others are more troubling, held together by threads of evidence that are real but frustratingly incomplete. Let's walk through the most significant. Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a 31-year-old barrister and schoolteacher whose body was found floating in the Thames on December 31st, 1888, roughly 6 weeks after the final canonical murder. A retired senior police official, Sir Melville Macnaghten, wrote a private memo in 1894 naming Druitt as his preferred suspect, describing him as a man whose own family believed him responsible. The timing is tantalizing. The murders stopped. Druitt died. And it's true that Druitt had been dismissed from his teaching post in November 1888, under circumstances that remain unclear. The problem is that there is no direct evidence linking Druitt to any of the murders. No witnesses placing him near the scenes. No physical evidence. MacNaughton's memo was written 6 years after the fact, based on second-hand information, and contains several factual errors about Druitt's background. Researchers who have dug deeply into Druitt's life have found a troubled man, but not a killer. Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski was a Polish-born Jewish barber who had emigrated to London in the early 1880s. He suffered from severe mental illness, almost certainly schizophrenia, and was eventually committed to an asylum in 1891. He remained institutionalized for the rest of his life, dying in 1919. He was named as a suspect in the same MacNaughton memo that implicated Druitt, described as a man with a deep hatred of women who lived among them in Whitechapel. In 2014, a businessman named Russell Edwards published a book claiming that DNA analysis of a shawl allegedly found near Catherine Eddowes' body had matched Kosminski. The claim made international headlines. The scientific community was significantly more skeptical. The chain of custody for the shawl is deeply questionable. There is no verified documentation placing it at the crime scene. The DNA methodology used in the analysis was challenged by other researchers. And Kosminski, despite being monitored in an asylum for nearly 3 decades, was never recorded as having confessed or even referenced the murders. Is he the Ripper? Possibly. But the evidence is not what the headlines said it was. Walter Sickert, perhaps the most provocative theory of the modern era, was put forward in 2002 by crime novelist Patricia Cornwell, who spent millions of dollars and destroyed a number of Sickert's paintings in pursuit of her conclusion. Walter Sickert was one of the most celebrated British artists of the late Victorian and Edwardian era. He was also, by many accounts, a deeply strange and unsettling figure. He had an obsessive interest in the Ripper murders. He painted dark domestic scenes, women in dingy rooms, vulnerable and alone. He reportedly told acquaintances that the room he rented in Camden had previously been occupied by the Ripper himself. Cornwell matched what she identified as mitochondrial DNA from a stamp or envelope licked by the Ripper letter writer to DNA from Sickert's correspondence. The theory attracted enormous attention and enormous criticism in equal measure. The DNA evidence was widely disputed. Sickert's known whereabouts during key nights remain unclear. And the question of motive, why a celebrated, well-connected artist would be prowling the slums of Whitechapel murdering women, is one the theory never satisfactorily answers. Yet Sickert continues to haunt the investigation, because if not him, then why was he so fascinated? Why the paintings? Why the stories he told? Some questions have no clean answers. After 130 years, after thousands of researchers, after a dozen serious DNA attempts, after books and documentaries and entire careers devoted to this single question, what do we actually know? We know that the Ripper was almost certainly local. Someone who knew Whitechapel's streets well enough to navigate them in near darkness and disappear without a trace. The murders were concentrated within a remarkably small geographic area, suggesting the killer was comfortable and familiar with his environment. We know that he killed quickly. Forensic analysis of the injuries suggests that most of the victims died within a matter of minutes. He wasn't slow. He wasn't cautious. He struck and moved, which speaks to confidence. The confidence of someone who had either done this before or had thought about it extensively. We know that the post-mortem mutilations, particularly in the later murders, showed a degree of anatomical knowledge that goes beyond what an ordinary person would possess. This has led many investigators to conclude that the killer had some medical background. A doctor, a surgeon, a medical student, a slaughterhouse worker who had spent years working with animal anatomy. Something that gave him both the knowledge and the psychological distance to do what he did. We know that he stopped. The question of why he stopped is one of the most debated in the entire case. Did he die? Like Druitt in the Thames? Was he committed to an institution? Did he flee the country? Did he simply stop? Serial killers almost never simply stop. The psychological compulsion that drives them doesn't switch off, which suggests that something external interrupted the cycle. And we know, with a certainty that has only grown over the decades, that whoever he was not caught. Not then, not now. There is something uniquely disturbing about Jack the Ripper that goes beyond the crimes themselves. It's the fact that he walked away. He stood in those foggy streets of Whitechapel. He did what he did. And then he went home. He slept. He ate breakfast. He perhaps read the newspapers and watched the city convulse around the mystery he had created. And then, eventually, for whatever reason, he simply stopped. The women he killed deserved better than to become footnotes in a mystery story. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Their names should be remembered. Not as victims in a puzzle, but as people. Real, complicated, struggling people who were failed by a world that left them vulnerable. And failed again by a justice system that couldn't protect them or avenge them. The Ripper became a legend. They became statistics. That imbalance has always bothered me. The investigation into the Whitechapel murders is, in a very real sense, still open. Not officially, but in the minds of the thousands of researchers who have spent their lives circling this mystery. It has never truly closed. Somewhere, almost certainly, the answer exists. In a census record, in a letter, in a piece of DNA that hasn't yet been tested against the right sample. The truth of who walked those streets in the autumn of 1888 is encoded somewhere in history. Waiting. But until that day, if it ever comes, the fog keeps its secret. And Whitechapel remembers everything. And we are back. Thank you guys so much for spending tonight with me in Whitechapel. This one has been sitting with me for a while. It's a case I have enormous respect for and enormous frustration with in equal measure. I hope you felt both of those things too. If there's a specific angle on this case you want me to go deeper on, the suspects, the police investigation, the letters, the world that made Whitechapel what it was, let me know in the comments. There's more to say. There is always more to say with this one. Stay safe out there. Watch out for the fog. I love you all. And good night.